Tangmolo Tashitelek, welcome everybody to the second day of the Alternative Olympic Committee session. We are going to begin today's session with a moment of silence for all the Tibetans, Uyghurs, Southern Mongolians, Hong Kongers, and Chinese who have lost their lives in the resistance against CCP. Okay, thank you for joining us in the moment of silence. Before we start with the session today, we, the moderators, would like to introduce ourselves briefly. My name is Tashi Shizitsang. I am the president of the Tibetan Youth Association in Europe. We are based in Switzerland and have chapters across whole Europe. Boshuan?
Okay. Okay, so hi everybody. My name is Pongshen Li, and I'm the East Asia Regional Coordinator of the International Tibet Network. And I'm a Taiwanese and based in Taiwan, assisting the Tibet groups here in the East Asia, including like Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. And so thank you guys again for joining us. And just in case that some of us here didn't come to our previous session yesterday, before we start everything, I would like to introduce a bit of our session once again. So right now, as we're having this session, actually the International Olympic Committee is also doing their 137th session, which, you know, their agenda is mainly focusing on updating about the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing, China. And as you guys might know, like, you know, this update of the Beijing Winter Olympic would be very much lack of the accounts from, you know, the Tibetans, Uyghur, Southern Mongolians, Hong Kongers, Chinese inside China, and also other people, you know, that are under the persecution of CCP. So this is the reason why that we're here together, and, you know, to present our voice of these oppressed people. And also I would just to give an update on the human rights situation, you know, in the region recently. It would just be really brief, and I believe that our panelists would have more to talk about later. But, you know, we have in the past few years, we have witnessed this constant trend of the human rights situation in the places under CCP occupation and control. You know, it's not only in Tibet, you know, there'll be so many recent cases of like torture and death in custody in just recent months. There was like this 19-year-old monk Tenzin Nima, there was the tour guide Kumjo Jingba, and also more, like as you guys might see in many social media or in the reports of those human rights organizations. And also in East Turkestan, like the Uyghur issue has been like a big cause for these years. Like in the past Women's Day on March 8th, there were also like voice highlighting, amplifying the systematic rapes and discrimination on Uyghur women, and also like the concentration camps and everything. And also we see like in Southern Mongolia, there are backfire of CCP, you know, abolishing their Mongolian language education. It is still continuing also, so as well as the crackdown. And we can see that the Chinese President Xi Jinping has also mentioned, you know, this as an issue in one of the convention, and it asked the official to solve the problems. And also in Hong Kong, there's been this, you know, unprecedented crackdown on people who supported or participated in the pro-democracy movements. We've witnessed in the beginning of this was this persecution on the 47 activists under the national security law. And just today, we also see the Chinese government, they have profoundly altered the electoral system of Hong Kong. And also, as well as other people, the Chinese people inside China that suffer from the tightening censorship and have this limited access to all kind of information in the outside world. So even in the surrounding areas, we can see China have been attempting to project its power to the nearby countries and nearby oceans, so which has caused so many unrest in the South China Sea, as everybody can see. And it also has been not only a regional bully, but also an exporter of authoritarianism. We can see that there are so many the Chinese shadow in the recent democratic protests in the Southeast Asia also. So regarding the campaign we're going against the decision of International Olympic Committee. Right now, we are already having this coalition of the group from different movements who have gone together to initiate this campaign and address our concern of the 2022 Winter Olympic Games in Beijing. And we're going to do this by targeting the governments of the games and also the athletes who's plan to participate and the different individual national Olympic committees in different countries. And to deliver that we learned from the 2008 Summer Olympics in Beijing to the world. And the failed promises of the Chinese government raising their human rights standard when they were awarded the game and when they have those kind of promises. And also, we can see that in 2014, the IOC they actually had done something. They had included human rights protection in the host city contracts, just trying to offering a certain level of protection against the threats directly to the game themselves. But however, we haven't seen the IOC really implementing them. And again, a robust policy toward the Chinese human rights abuses, it would be more than necessary now in order to let the Olympic Games become an endorsement, in order not to let the Olympic game to be an endorsement to what China has done. So that's why we're having, this really important session today. And I'm gonna having Jashi taking over to introduce the speakers.
Yes, thank you, Bonshon, for introducing the topic of our session today. As we can all see, we have plenty of things to talk about. So now we're going to welcome our speakers for today's session. First off, we have Julie Milsap. She is the Director of Public Affairs and Advocacy at Campaign for Uyghurs. Her background is in political science and education. She joined Campaign for Uyghurs when she moved back to the US after living in China, where she witnessed the deteriorating human rights situation. A warm welcome to you, Julie. Then we have next up Enghebatu Togochog. He is the founder and the director of the Southern Mongolian Human Rights Information Center. Founded in New York in 2001, the SMHRIC is a human rights organization dedicated to promoting and protecting the rights of the Mongolian people in Chinese-occupied Southern Mongolia. Warm welcome to you too, Enghebatu. Next up, we have François Xu. He is an advocate for human rights, a Tiananmen student leader, and the co-founder and current president of Humanitarian China. Humanitarian China is dedicated to promoting human rights and civil society in China. For more than a decade, the organization has provided humanitarian aid to hundreds of families of political prisoners. Now, recently, Humanitarian China is also providing humanitarian aid to Hong Kong democracy protesters. It's very nice to have you here, François.
Thank you.
Up next, we have Lhadon Tethong. Lhadon Tethong is a Tibetan independence activist and director of Tibet Action Institute, where she leads a team of technologists and rights advocates developing open source technologies, strategies, and training programs for Tibetans and others living under extreme repression. Formerly the executive director of Students for Free Tibet International, Lhadon led the high-profile global campaign to condemn China's rule of Tibet in the lead-up to and during the 2008 Beijing Olympic Games. Hi, Lhadon, nice to have you here. Then next up, we have Benedict Rogers. Benedict is the co-founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch. He's also senior analyst for East Asia at Christian Solidarity Worldwide, an advisor to both the Interparliamentary Alliance on China and the Stop Uyghur Genocide campaign. Benedict is also a member of the board of the China Democracy Foundation and the co-founder and deputy chair of the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission. A warm welcome to all the speakers. Thank you so much for joining us on today's session. Now we are going to move on to the first bit of our session.
Yes, so thank you, Jessie, for introducing all the panelists. So now we're gonna move on to the opening remarks from speakers. So we're gonna have our first speaker as Julie from the Campaign for Uyghurs. So please.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here today in the company of such distinguished warriors for human rights. I have to admit, as I think all of us feel, I'm a little bit flustered and indeed furious that this type of panel is still necessary. Right now, as we speak, there are at least 3 million Uyghurs who are held in the Chinese regime's concentration camps with crematoria built nearby. This in the modern age, detained based on ethnic identity and having committed no crime. Many more are enslaved in factories across China to manufacture PPE and good for brands like Zara, Nike, IKEA, all the big brands that we know and love. Their children taken to state-run orphanages where they're subject to brainwashing. And as was mentioned earlier, women are being brutalized in these particularly horrific ways, as camp survivors have testified. Gang rape, torture, all sorts of mental, physical, and sexual abuse. Many who are even outside the camps are also being forced into marriages outside of their ethnicity with Han Chinese men, and they're unable to refuse as they might be labeled as extremists. They've had their bodies, their fertility controlled by the CCP, and are subject to forced abortion, sterilization, and mandatory birth control. The Chinese regime has itself publicly remarked on these women to blatantly dehumanize them, referring to them as baby-making machines, as many may have heard, and publicly choosing to denounce testimony from these victims by slandering them, attacking their reputations, and effectively slut-shaming them. It is absolutely preposterous that in this day and age, there can even be a consideration that Beijing is an appropriate city to host the Olympics. As has been confirmed by the United States and now seen by Canadian and Dutch parliament's affirmation as well, Uyghurs in East Turkestan are facing active genocide. So our organization released a report in July of last year on this topic of genocide. And this week, we also saw this confirmation with the new report compiled by multiple experts, which also affirms each of the ways that the Chinese regime has breached the Genocide Convention. Uyghurs are dying. This is not an exaggeration. The international community sold its soul and turned its back on Tibet. And we know that a bully that remains unconfronted will continue to grow. Now, as Uyghurs are facing extermination in their homeland, while the CCP profits off of their slave labor, as Hong Kong lost its promised democratic freedoms, as Southern Mongolians see the final remnants of their beloved language, culture, and very lives in Southern Mongolia under attack, it is clear that ignoring genocide is not an option. As concerns the Olympics, we are repeating the Berlin 1936 Games. Every Uyghur in diaspora has at least one family member who's been unlawfully detained or is missing and is unable to be confirmed as being alive. The CCP is functioning as an international criminal organization that takes innocent people hostage, both those it considers as its own residents and those who aren't. Many who are taken are as direct retaliation for having connections abroad or with activists. So in what world does this sound like it will fit with the supposed spirit of the Olympic Games? Hu Xijin, the editor-in-chief of the Global Times, the Chinese state-backed media outlet, said that China will seriously sanction any country that follows a call to boycott the Olympics. This is undoubtedly the approach the Chinese regime would like to take, and also reflects the ways in which they view the concept of diplomacy in general. What's truly shocking is that the IOC continues to hide behind the lie of being non-political. Just look at how China views this situation. It is far beyond a political situation, and the IOC are enabling it. Those who choose profit over the values of humanity are contributing to crimes against humanity, and the gravity of that should be allowed to sink in for each of us. We can have no part of these genocide games. I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of my co-panelists, and thank you very much for this event.
Thank you so much, Julie, for your opening remark. Then I'd like to ask Enghebatu to give your opening remark.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Sambachano Jashitale. My name is Enghebatu Togochog. I am the president of the Southern Mongolian Human Rights Information Center. First of all, I'd like to thank Dashi, Pingshuan, and Mandy for organizing this event and inviting me to this panel. The topic of the panel, Genocide Games, couldn't be more timely and right to the point. China really is becoming a genocide juggernaut, crushing all its occupied nations and territories in its path, physically, culturally, and spiritually. Millions of Uyghurs are locked up in concentration camp. Tibetans are denied the right to religious freedom. Southern Mongolians are denied the right to mother tongue, suffering under China's ongoing cultural genocide. Of course, these are just few instances of active genocide that China is committing as we speak in front of the eyes of the international community. If we look back at the past 7 decades of colonial occupation, millions of Tibetans, Mongolians, and Uyghurs have lost their lives in the waves of genocide campaigns. Since 1949, we Southern Mongolians have experienced at least 2 major genocides. One is the so-called the purge of the members of a national separatist group, Inner Mongolian People's Party, from the late 1960s through 1970s. Estimated the 100,000 Mongolians were tortured to death and 500,000 imprisoned, tortured, and maimed. At that time, the total Mongolian population in Southern Mongolia is about 1.5 million. This means 1 out of 3 Mongolians were persecuted in this genocide campaign. The other one is the ongoing cultural genocide that China launched last September with an euphemism of second-generation bilingual education, aiming to wipe out the Mongolian language from educational system across Southern Mongolia. In response to this policy, a region-wide civil disobedience resistance movement took place in Southern Mongolia. At least 300,000 students took to the streets to protest this policy. Almost entire Southern Mongolian population participated in the movement in one form or another. The Chinese government immediately cracked down on the movement and arrested around 8,000 to 10,000 Southern Mongolians. Thousands of them are still detained, imprisoned, or under house arrest without any legal due process. Following this, the harsh crackdown on the resistance movement, the initially advertised bilingual education now turned into a wholesale cultural genocide campaign. The scope of the campaign has exceeded far beyond switching the medium of instruction from Mongolian to Chinese in schools. What's happening in Southern Mongolia now is another cultural revolution that is aiming to wipe out Mongolian culture and identity once and then for all in Southern Mongolia, and create a homogeneous Chinese society. That's exactly what's exactly happening in Southern Mongolia. So I hope we have more time to talk about more details about what's exactly happening in Southern Mongolia during the open discussion and the question and answer sessions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Enghebatu, for this very precise briefing on the human rights situation in Southern Mongolia. And later on, I would like to ask Lhadon to have your opening remark, please.
Hi, great, thank you. I wish I could say it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. It is a pleasure to see and work with all of you. It is a travesty that we even have to talk about Beijing hosting the Olympic Games again for all of us. And I'll start focusing on Tibet, but I'll zoom out a bit for just brief opening remarks. So yes, like Enghebatu said, and the speaker before him about the Uyghurs, China is trying to destroy Tibetan resistance, Tibetan people, by eliminating the Tibetan identity and the political struggle. It's clear now that the Chinese government is hell-bent on eliminating Tibetan identity, because just by being Tibetan, the very existence of Tibetans as a distinct cultural, religious, and linguistic identity, it's a threat to the state. Because Tibetans are different, and because their loyalty is not with the Chinese Communist Party of China, or even China as a nation, this is why they must be destroyed. And this could not have been more clear in 2008, when protests swept across all 3 provinces of historical Tibet and challenged the Chinese government at the moment it mattered most to them, in the lead up to the Olympic Games in Beijing in 2008, when the authorities wanted to ensure there were no signs of instability or dissent anywhere in China. In this project to eliminate Tibetan identity is being carried out in every space. In the workplace, in the monasteries, in schools, on the grasslands, in towns, neighborhoods, and private homes. The party, the Chinese Communist Party, is everywhere. And outside of Tibet, China is trying to destroy the Tibetan exile movement and government by choking off the flow of Tibetans from Tibet, who've traditionally filled the Tibetan exile school system and the monasteries and given life to the Tibetan political movement. In practical terms, this means since 2008, where thousands of Tibetans once escaped each year on foot over the Himalayan mountains into Nepal and India, now only a trickle of some maybe dozens will make it out of Tibet through increased Chinese patrols, even at the highest passes. And because they use high-tech surveillance methods, including drones and facial recognition technology. In 2017, I think it was reported that only 80 made it out, and the number is even fewer now. So of course, the final piece here is to take control of Tibet and the future of Tibet by selecting the next Dalai Lama and controlling the institution of the Dalai Lama. This we can see the Communist Party is setting up to do. They have, all of this is because they have tried and failed for 60 plus years to control the Tibetan people and to govern and rule over them. And so now they have to use an instrument that is so totally against one of the core beliefs of the atheist system and government, the institution of the Dalai Lama, a Buddhist leader, to try to control Tibet in the future once and for all. So not only are they crushing everything inside Tibet, and they're trying to eliminate the Tibetan exile political movement, and they try to control Tibetans in exile through spies and coercion and all sorts of things. But then they're trying to, of course, take control of the future of Tibet by hijacking the precious, most valued institution of the Dalai Lama. So where does that leave us? With the Olympic Games, again, it's just, like I said, it's a travesty that we're even here to have to talk about the Olympic Games in Beijing again, in China again, and that the world would not only that I have no illusions that the Olympic Committee would do the right thing, because they didn't do the right thing back then, and they have shown time and time again to be an elite, unaccountable, non-transparent, and corrupt organization. But that the international community will allow this to happen and support the Olympic Games taking place in Beijing when we have a modern day genocide occurring in 2021 to the Uyghur people in front of the world. There is no doubt, the proof is there, that we are even considering, that the world is even considering supporting these games, that government leaders would even consider going to these games. It's outrageous. It must be protested from every corner of the world where there are people of conscience in government, civil society, grassroots, in the media. It is up to us, I believe, and all of our peoples and networks to work to make this one of the greatest costs Beijing has ever had. So the Chinese government has had virtually no accountability for all of the horrors that they're carrying out in Hong Kong, in China itself, to the Tibetans, to the Uyghurs, to the Southern Mongolians. And now I believe is the time for there to be a real cost on the Beijing government, the Beijing regime. And I think we know how much they care about these displays, how much this means to them, this platform and this moment. And it will be, if it goes ahead as planned, and if world leaders are there, it will be an endorsement of the Chinese Communist Party and its authoritarian policies and its genocide in East Turkestan, and the long-term genocide it's playing out for all of the Southern Mongolians, Tibetans, everyone. And if we stop it, or if we're able to really put a dent in the numbers that show up, or the people that are there, or the political, diplomatic, expression of support that they have for that, I think it will truly make a difference. And it can. The threat of boycott alone can push the Chinese leadership back, push the regime back. A serious threat of a boycott and a diplomatic boycott before the games can actually mitigate what is happening. And I think that's the only way forward. And I'm so glad to be here with all of you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ladila, for briefing us on the situation, not only inside Tibet, but the Tibetan freedom movement outside Tibet too, and highlighting China's systematic crackdown on Tibetan resistance. Now, moving on to the next speaker, I'd like to ask Benedict to give his opening remarks.
Thank you very much. It's I agree with all the other speakers so far in saying that it's a travesty that we're having to hold this event, but it is a privilege to speak alongside all the other speakers. And I think it is very welcome that all the different parts of the picture, all the different people groups who are suffering under the Chinese Communist Party regime are coming together to stand together in this particular movement. And although my focus in my remarks today will be on Hong Kong, I want to say that I'm also deeply involved and very actively supportive of the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, Southern Mongolia, but also other people in China who aren't represented on this panel. Christians in China are facing the worst persecution since the Cultural Revolution. Civil society, bloggers, human rights defenders, citizen journalists, Falun Gong, and the issue of organ harvesting. And if there is one report that puts all these elements together, and that I would say policymakers around the world should read as they think about the 2022 Olympics, and the IOC itself should read this report. It's a report that was published in January this year by the UK's Conservative Party Human Rights Commission, which incidentally, it is a party body, but the report is a non-party political report. It's a report that regardless of your own politics, I think anyone who cares about human rights can embrace. It's a report called The Darkness Deepens, and it shows the shocking deterioration in human rights in China over the last few years. The other thing I'd like to say before I come on to Hong Kong is that it was mentioned earlier that we shouldn't forget the CCP's responsibility for human rights violations that go on in other countries beyond its borders. I've worked for 20 years and still work now on Burma or Myanmar. And although there's no evidence to suggest that the CCP in any way instigated the coup on the 1st of February, certainly they have given diplomatic and other forms of cover for the coup leaders and for their brutal repression in the last 6 weeks, including blocking action at the United Nations Security Council, Chinese state media describing the coup as a major cabinet reshuffle, and describing the horrific brutality against peaceful protesters as an internal matter for Myanmar. So that should be taken into consideration, as well as China's own domestic human rights record. But let me turn quickly to Hong Kong, and it feels very appropriate, although very poignant, to be speaking about Hong Kong on this panel today, on the very day that the final nails were hammered into the coffin of whatever remained of Hong Kong's democracy. What has been announced by the National People's Congress today amounts to the complete dismantling of Hong Kong's democracy, freedoms, autonomy, and one country, two systems, in total violation of both Hong Kong's own mini constitution, the Basic Law, and the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Of course, this has been building up for the last 7 years, at least, since the Umbrella Movement in 2014, and signs of erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms even before that, and particularly over the last year with the introduction of the very draconian national security law. And the nature of the national security law should give the IOC pause for thought, because not only does the national security law silence any freedom of expression or other freedoms in Hong Kong, but it also has an extraterritorial clause. And so in effect, in theory, by speaking about these issues here today in this webinar, and indeed pretty much every day, several times a day since the 1st of July last year, when the law was imposed on Hong Kong, I am in breach of the national security law, and by extension, you're in breach of the national security law by sharing this platform with me. Now, all of us are in free societies where it's not going to have major consequences for us, but it could have major consequences for Hong Kongers who are abroad, who might take part in protests or other activities overseas. And if they were to go back to Hong Kong, they could be vulnerable under the national security law. One of the most egregious, most recent examples of the national security law and its severity was the arrest in January, but the charging last week of 47 pro-democracy activists charged under the national security law for the crime, in inverted commas, of having carried out a primary election last summer to choose candidates for the pro-democracy camp for the what were due to be the Legislative Council elections supposed to be held last September. And in the end, those elections were postponed. It looks like they're going to be postponed again. But these 47 people who only carried out a primary election, something that's a perfectly normal part of any election system, have now been charged on under this law, detained, denied bail, and are likely to spend some years behind bars. The national security law is also there are proposals to implement national security education in Hong Kong's school system, effectively indoctrinating children from the age of 6 years old onwards both about what they shouldn't do under the national security law, prohibiting them from being associated with any songs or slogans or other prohibited activities, but also indoctrinating them on the virtues of the Chinese Communist Party, its great success in handling COVID-19, its rights in the South China Sea, and all the rest of the CCP's propaganda. And that will now be at the heart of Hong Kong's education system for kids as young as 6 years old. And I could go on. It's fair to say that almost all of the key pro-democracy leaders in Hong Kong are now either in jail or on trial or in exile. And some of the key people like Joshua Wong and Agnes Chow and Jimmy Lai are in prison. And it's tragic that one of what was until relatively recently one of Asia's most open and freest cities, and a city that was promised freedom and autonomy under an international treaty, has now become yet another closed and repressed part of the Chinese Communist Party's territory. So I'm fully supportive of the calls that I know we'll discuss here about the 2022 Winter Olympics. I certainly believe they shouldn't be held. I believe that the IOC should move the games from Beijing to another country that would be an acceptable host. But if the IOC really won't move on that, then I think we definitely should be encouraging a diplomatic boycott. No government representatives, leaders, VIPs from as many countries as possible should go. We should have a consumer boycott. Spectators shouldn't go to the games. We should have pressure on corporate sponsors of the games. But we should also use, if it does take place in Beijing, in China, we should use the opportunity to really protest and shine a spotlight on China's genocide and crimes against humanity and breaches of international law and grave human rights violations. And one of the things we might think about doing in preparation for that, if we can't get the IOC to move the games, is to use the Tokyo Summer Games this year as a precursor to the Beijing Games. So to think about holding protests in Tokyo, where there is freedom to protest, depending on what happens with COVID, of course, to use the Tokyo Games to protest against the forthcoming Beijing Games. So because of the complete dismantling of Hong Kong's promised freedoms, because of the genocide of the Uyghurs, because of the terrible crimes against humanity committed in Tibet and southern Mongolia and against many other people under the CCP's brutal rule, we should unite and coordinate our efforts to either stop the Beijing Games from happening or to protest in the biggest and most effective and most possible way to shame Beijing over their crimes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Benedict, for elaborating the context of what happened next to the NSL and what the prosecution is going on right now. And also, you've mentioned some really good strategies, for campaigning. And I hope we can really elaborate that in our Q&A session. And so the last panelist we're going to have is Fang Zheng from Humanitarian China. So I would like to welcome Fang Zheng, please.
Thank you, Tashi and Peng Shuang, for hosting this important meeting on such a serious topic. I have been a proponent of boycotting Beijing Olympics since last year, and I'm glad to see it's gaining momentum. The title of this meeting says it all. The IOC is awarding an Olympic game, which should be something for peace, freedom, love to a regime that's committing genocide actively now. And this is outrage, and we must boycott, we must act, and we must work together. And as Benedict has outlined, there are many strategies we can implement. As president of Humanitarian China, I'm keenly aware of the ever deteriorating human rights situations in China. For example, as we are talking today, this is the 1-year anniversary of New York City lockdown, and we are still suffering from it. People are dying. This is a global disaster because China has no freedom of speech, and the doctor who first tried to breach the news, Li Wenliang, he was reprimanded and later died. And he subsequently became a hero among Chinese people. But now the Chinese government is trying to do everything to erase his memory. They are trying to cover up. As of yesterday, I think Politico, there's an article about the problem of this virus being discovered as early as 2017. It's probably some early concern from U.S. diplomats who was there in Wuhan to visit that lab. In 2019, as I was testifying at U.S. Congress on the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen massacre, I specifically warned of this danger of China's research into biological developments without any transparency into it. It is a disaster in the making, combining the most sophisticated technology with such a regime that's burnt on control, by fear and violence. This is a risk the whole world is facing. And of course, we know people like Zhang Zhan, who was a lawyer and a citizen journalist, and she was sentenced to 4 years in prison simply for trying to know the truth, trying to interview people in Wuhan. And she is still on hunger strike. That means her life is still in danger every day. And there are other citizen journalists like Fang Zheng, who was disappeared, and Chen Qiushi, who was never heard of after his appearance in Wuhan about a year ago, and so many others. This is the kind of the price that the world will have to pay if we allow this regime to dominate. And that's what this Olympic 2022 will do. It will legitimize such a regime and give it a platform to showcase its power. And of course, more disasters will happen, not only to people in China, but to everyone in this world, just like this pandemic. And recently, Li Qiaochu, the police want to charge her. She was a labor activist, feminist, and she is also a girlfriend of Xu Zhiyu, who is one of the most famous activists in China. She was detained simply for speaking out on Xu Zhiyong's mistreatment in prison. Now she is arrested. And there are also cases, for example, like Cheng Yuan, who was one of the three of the Changsha Gongyi. These are the people who were trying to serve the underprivileged, and they did such a great work that eventually it caught the attention of the communist government. Now, almost 2 years passed. We don't know what's happening to them. So that's the kind of situation in China that Chinese people are facing. Of course, this it's not, as I said, this is not limited to people in China geographically. For example, here in the United States, my account was censored by Zoom simply for having this conference on Zoom commemorating Tiananmen massacre 31 anniversary. This is a US global company, and now it's gaining popularity because of pandemic. But from the FBI indictment later, you can see this company, it's specifically obeying Beijing on the orders given by an agent called Jin Xinjiang, who was paid by Zoom, but was actually working for Chinese government. So that's a kind of sad, tragic combination of free market economy and a totalitarian regime. That's a kind of correlation we are facing now that makes our work really very difficult. And recently on Clubhouse, about a month ago, I was able to speak to thousands of people from mainland who are very eager to hear about Tiananmen massacre and the truth of Uyghur genocide. But a few hours later, this app was censored, banned in China. But to me, this is not a surprise. What surprised, what is not normal is that the technology companies are kind of normalizing it. They are treating it as if something that's custom you have to do. So eventually they will be forced into a situation. They'll follow, for example, the example of LinkedIn, where they have a China model and an outside China model, basically legitimizing this separation, this repression of freedom of speech, and enabling the Chinese government to brainwash Chinese people, indoctrinate them with the dangerous ideologies. Talking about extraterritorial reach, for example, one of the people we try to help is Bao Mengmeng. He is the son of Wang Yu, one of the most famous female lawyer in China, and she was awarded prestigious reward by the US State Department a couple of days ago. We were trying to bring Bao Zhuoxuan out from China because his parents were all arrested, and he was also under house arrest. So we successfully brought him to Burma, but the Chinese police came to Burma and kidnapped him and two others were helping him back to China and the son and two other people, they were all tortured in prison. So, and we all know the case of Gui Minhai. He was kidnapped from Thailand back to China. So yeah, even here in the United States, in year 2008, I was beaten by Chinese supporters in San Francisco Bay Area. This was 12 years ago at the other Olympic, while the torch was passing San Francisco. I believe it was over 100,000 Chinese who were really just brainwashed. But yeah, they were driven by such a blind hatred that they beat us while the police was watching. Yeah, San Francisco police was watching. I asked San Francisco police, I said, did you give the exclusive use of this area to the Chinese supporters? The police said no. I said, then you have to protect us. The police did nothing. Yeah, that's what's happening now. It's not only in China to Chinese people; it's happening everywhere. So, well, we all have to face this, confront this. There's a lot we can do. I think what's important is that this is something that definitely Beijing cares, and that's where we can have influence on. And I think the big supporters for the Olympics, of course, are the corporations and governments. But we do have strong support from the general public and the media. And that's where we can leverage our presence. I think if we work together, this is definitely something we can all engage on very effectively. We can talk more about this later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Fang Zheng, so much for your really detailed introduction of all the cases. I think that's really, really important. And I think right now we're gonna move on to the Q&A session. We've already seen a couple of questions raising from both of our Facebook and the YouTube platform. And I will right now read out our first question here, and please, like, if any of the panelists, if you're ready, you can just opinion and answer it. Okay, so the first question is, as we heard in yesterday's panel, which is mostly talking about the 2008 Olympic Game in Beijing, the 2008 Olympics campaign was really prolific, but we can already see that the 2022 Olympics campaign has been characterized in very different ways than the past 2008 campaign. What do you think has changed from 2008 to now, either for better or for worse, that makes the No Beijing 2022 campaign distinct from the 2008 movement?
Okay, I can.
Yes,
Oh,
please think about it.
Okay, yeah, as I mentioned before, 2008, at that time, most people of the world were very optimistic about China's political future. People were hoping that civil society will develop and technology and globalization will eventually change China. But this, I think, this was the year of the peak optimism. And it's also the year that China definitely took very openly repressive just policies. Before that, they were kind of hiding its intention to many ways. I think they were successful in fooling the world. After 2008, it definitely changed. I think one reason is because of the financial problem of the United States. The other one, of course, that's a natural trajectory of such a regime. To us, it's not a surprise. But for many people who were looking, for example, the so-called China watchers community in the United States, they always try to find any reason to appease China. But after 2008, China wouldn't even care so much about its external appearance. I think one reason is that this Olympics, the success of it, gave it this sense of invincibility. As I was protesting in San Francisco, I believe it was one official from the Chinese consulate. He actually approached me before we were beaten. So he asked me, "Who are you?" I said, "Zhou Fengsuo." And he said, "Oh, you sound familiar." I said, "Oh, yes, of course. This is Tiananmen. You should remember." And he said, "Don't make trouble now." And so that's what the other Chinese supporters of CCP who were around him, they all echoed him, say, "Oh, this is national pride," or whatever. I said, "You are here for this regime. I'm here for Hu Jia, who was sentenced to 4 years in prison simply for peacefully just promoting civil society ideas on environmentalism, a lot of issues. He is a pacifist, and China sentenced him to 4 years in prison while the Olympic torch was being passed on. This was like the first sign for this government to thump on its breast while to boast of its human rights violation because the world doesn't care. So they sentenced Hu Jia to 4 years in prison. I always remember that. I remember this moment very clearly because this was like to many people, this should be the year of awakening, and a lot of things turn dark from there in a very transparent way. After that, they wouldn't even hide it. So I think it's very clear last 12 years what kind of trajectory that China has gone down. If we use that for the next 12 years after 2022 Beijing Olympics, it's just horrible even to imagine what will happen. So.
Yes. Thank you, Fengsuo, for the great answer. And I see that Enghebatu, would you like to follow up with this question?
Yes. Thank you. I totally agree with Zhou Fengsuo. I think that one of the biggest differences between the 2008 and 2022 Olympics, from Chinese perspective, China and the Chinese regime is increasingly aggressive, increasingly flagrant, and increasingly confident in violating human rights in Southern Mongolia, Tibet, and East Turkestan, Hong Kong, and then even in China proper. In 2008, China was not as aggressive, not as confident as it is now. Now China is not shy about destroying the entire nation of Mongolia and Southern Mongolia, Tibet, and Uyghurs. It could publicly stating that China's goal is to convert all these the so-called 55 ethnic minorities into homogeneous Chinese population. It's already publicly being stated, and genocide is committed in front of the eyes of the world. And the millions of Uyghurs are locked up and in concentration camp. Tibetans and Mongolians are denied the right to practice their tradition, culture, and even denied the right to speak their language. So in China now is like there is a official slogan called "Speak Chinese to become a civilized person." This official slogan is broadcast through all radio and TV channels in Southern Mongolia. I think it's same is happening in Tibet and East Turkestan also. Behind all this is Xi Jinping's new call for the so-called inculcating the Chinese nationality, common identity, or in Chinese called 中华民族 中华民族共同体意识. This is the very core of this theory is to completely destroy all these 55 ethnic minorities. A few years ago, some Chinese official scholars came up with the so-called second generation national ethnic policy. It was debated at that time, and those scholars went to Southern Mongolia and tried to test out how it worked. And so of course they met with strong protest from Southern Mongolians, and then it was kept a while, and then now Chinese government is publicly using this policy, second generation ethnic policy, and then Xi Jinping skillfully turned it into the new policy called inculcating Chinese nationality, common identity. The main idea is that Tibetans and Mongolians and Uyghurs and then all other ethnic minorities do not need to have a separate ethnic identity. They are all Chinese. They are all Chinese Zhonghua nationality. So this is the big change since 2008. At that time, China was not that this confident in promoting this type of idea and policy. So from the international perspective, the world is still pretty much silent. Democratic world's reaction to China's action is very slow and hesitant. China is not hesitating to commit genocide one after another in East Turkestan, Tibet, and Southern Mongolia. But the democratic governments are very hesitant to call this genocide as genocide. So this is the world that we are living in now, unfortunately. Thank you.
Can I just start? I'll just jump in and add here something. Yeah, so we spent so long working leading up to the Beijing 2008 Olympics. And yeah, our campaigns, our efforts from the Tibetan side were a hard sell. And then the 2008 uprising happened in Tibet, and we definitely saw the global spotlight and the international Olympic spotlight turn on to Tibet and a discussion of China's human rights situation and the occupation of Tibet, and that was all great. But ultimately, the games happened and legitimized the non-democratic authoritarian regime that rules all of us in China from Beijing, and emboldened, legitimized, illegitimate regime went forward and operated with like flagrant abuses at home and with a more belligerent and aggressive stance in the world. And I think that, the rise of Xi Jinping and any myth about trickle-down economics and trickle-down democracy, leading to China becoming the Chinese leadership or Chinese regime becoming more like the rest of the free and open world. I think all of that has just pretty much been, that has been destroyed, that idea. But one thing that strikes me with, like, right now, there's just with the genocide in East Turkestan and the situation for the Uyghurs, it is so obvious and so apparent. Even the most ardent China apologists that we've seen operating for years, I just feel like they can't do it. It's just pathetic that it took this absolutely devastating situation to occur, and a genocide for this level of realization and people willing to speak out, from the academic community to the think tanks to governments. But, here we are. And I think we have an obligation to, push our governments to see. I'm amazed by the polls. If you look at opinion polls, I mean, governments, our representatives in our free and democratic nations, they are elected by us, by the people. And if you look at what the people think, surveys of favorability ratings of China are terribly low. I think I just saw something like a Gallup poll that said it was almost 80% from a few days ago of unfavorable view of China from the American public. And, there are obviously discussions to be had about why that is and where the lines are in terms of what's good and bad about that. But I think for our purposes, for the sake of the Chinese people themselves and the rights defenders and those who want freedom and democracy and who are being crushed and disappeared, and for all of us, it behooves us to make our governments act and act stronger. There's just, even now, I feel like I'm getting nervous about some of the weak language and some of the the ways I see the pitfalls of policy, say, where climate policy may undercut where it shouldn't. We can do this all at once. But in terms of China's strategy, where climate policy and the need to get China's cooperation will be used by China, of course, to try to marginalize, sideline all of us and all discussions of the authoritarian system there. So there is incredible public support. We have to see that, own it, and use it to really hammer Beijing at this moment. I do think they're on the back foot in many different ways. And we have to see that weakness and go in and tackle it. And certainly working together, the solidarity that is apparent now, all of us together. I mean, we've always, Enghebatu, we've known each other for years. We've always come together at certain moments in our decades of activism and advocacy, the different groups and movements and peoples. But now we have such strong solidarity, and we know we must work together, and that makes us such an incredibly powerful force. And that's the difference now, I think, and that's what we must utilize. And we need to be bold. We should not be weak. We should ask for the moon. We should not stop halfway. If we don't push for the maximum, who does? If a genocide, a modern day genocide occurring in front of all of our eyes is not enough to push for the maximum, to demand the maximum punishment for the Chinese regime, then what is?
Thank you so much, everybody, for your very insightful answers. Now, to even dive in deeper into the 2022 Olympic Games, our next question will be, what do you think will be the direct consequences on the ground that will be felt by frontline communities if the IOC continues with its plan to host the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing? Maybe, Julie, you can start off with that question.
Sure. I think we have to be perfectly clear, as has been echoed in the answers that were just given, that this will be disastrous for frontline communities. China's already been emboldened to this point and enabled to this point, and they will just continue to feel further emboldened to carry out atrocities with absolutely no consequence. That's the main issue. They've faced no consequences for carrying out deliberate destruction of infinite thought, cultural distinctions, and human lives. So now, in the midst of active genocide, as we've already said multiple times, what else does it take to continue with this plan? We already know that the last hopes or even excuses that can be made by the IOC and the wider international community, these have already been destroyed. You know, it's absolutely clear. We have a country that's taken foreign citizens hostage in clearly retaliatory actions. And this is the country that we've picked to host the Olympics. This is the spirit of the games. So, you know, China has refused to allow independent inspections, journalists access, all of this, and they keep pushing back with the excuse it's not a convenient time for that. So all we can say is, if it's not a convenient time for that, then it's not a convenient time to host the games. And so, yeah, in short, I think we just have to be perfectly clear. The consequences will be felt just as they were in 2008 leading up to the Olympics and continuing afterwards, but on a scale perhaps unimaginable.
Thank you, Julie, for the great answer. And so, because we've got a lot of questions from the audience and we're kind of piling up, so I think we're going to jump to the question from the viewers now. So there is one question from the viewer saying that, is it possible now to successfully boycott Beijing 2022, considering the lack of willingness to act in the Western democratic world? So Benedict, would you like to answer this one?
Sure. The short answer to the question is yes, I believe it is still possible, because I think that consumer power can be very effective. We've already seen in some of our campaigns with regard to Uyghur slave labor in supply chains that consumer pressure on some of the major brand names that are believed to be using Uyghur slave labor, of course, without their knowledge, but once it's been pointed out to them, consumer pressure has been effective in getting some of them, at least, to change their ways. So I think that citizens can put pressure on their governments to not send political or diplomatic representatives. Equally, consumers can put pressure on corporate sponsors, and consumers can exercise their right not to travel to China for the games. And I just want to make one last quick point, which relates to the previous question, but also to this, which is that one of the possible consequences, if the games goes ahead, is, of course, that potentially forced labor, slave labor, may be deployed in the organizing or the production of facilities for the games. And that's another reason why consumers should think very carefully about how they exercise their consumer power to boycott the games. So even if the IOC goes ahead, even if government's positions currently are certainly weak, people can exercise pressure on their governments and on corporate sponsors and in other ways.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Benedict. Then we are moving on to the next question from the audience. China has threatened sanctions against countries that join in boycotting the 2022 Olympics. Do you think this will be enough to deter the global community from taking action? Yes, sure. Lhadon, please.
I think the key is work together, and I think the US and others have to lead, and that's our job, is to get governments acting and working together can create a protective block. And that is, I believe it's up to on many levels, it's up to the US to lead. Other governments, yes. But, you know, part of the reason for sure what's happening in East Turkestan to the Uyghurs is a result of the war on terror and the fact that the Chinese government was allowed to wrongly label an entire population of already oppressed people as Islamic fundamentalist terrorists, you know. So the US has a moral obligation and responsibility here to lead on this at this time, and organizing other countries to work together. I mean, that's the key. It can't be one country does one thing and one country does another. And, you know, wimpy little policies and practices. They need to organize themselves as a bloc and to work as a bloc. And that will challenge the Chinese government. That is why the Chinese government has picked off one nation here or there for retaliatory sanctions or, you know, whatnot. It's time to work together, and the US needs to lead.
Thank you, Lhadon. So is there any one of our panelists who would like to add on with this question? Yes, please, Enghebatu.
Yes, I agree with Lhadon about America's role. America should play very important role in this effort, but unfortunately, if you look at recent, especially from the policy or changing attitude from White House, or I'm sure you all might know what President Biden said recently about China, about Uyghur genocide. He publicly stating that, well, China, every country has a different, history and different background. So he pretty much just publicly was saying that we're not going to talk about Uyghur issue. We're not going to talk about the Hong Kong issue with China. And so it's, unfortunately, America is not really playing the role it's supposed to play. And one of the reasons behind this is mostly those big corporations that are really powerful in pushing the policy of just getting along with China and continue to have business with China. So I'm not too optimistic about America's role, at least at this moment. But again, we as citizens, we are as people, we can just work together to at least try to stop this from happening. That's my view. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just quickly chime in. I think it's true that we can't be too optimistic on the governments, but we should, and we have the advantage at public opinion, and that's where we should put our efforts on. I think for now we are definitely facing this hierarchical integration between China and Wall Street, but on the ground level, there's a lot more we can do.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you, Enghebatu and Fongso, for the question. And so now we're moving on to the next one, which is what can we do to put pressure on the IOC to change the game location? Benedict, would you like to answer this one?
Sure. I think there are a number of things that we can do. And I think regardless of whether we succeed in getting them to change the location, we should exert pressure on them so that it puts the issue and our concerns on the agenda, regardless of what their decision is in the end. And I think there are a number of things that could be done. One possibility is to try to mobilize, if not current athletes, if it's possible to find current athletes who would support this, that's great. But at least retired athletes who in a sense, don't have any stake in it, but who would have that sort of influence and moral authority as retired sports people. But another key point, I think, is that one of the IOC's arguments against it perhaps would be what's an alternative location that could be organized at a very short notice. And I'm aware that there are some political groups, I think, in Canada that are proposing Canada as an alternative location. And I think Canada has the right weather conditions for the Winter Olympics, the experienced facilities, experienced sports people in winter sports. So if the IOC could both come under pressure to move the games, but also be presented with an alternative offer, whether that's Canada or whether another country steps forward, that would be the way to have a chance of influencing them.
I mean, even if it happens, there's a lot that people can do. For example, these athletes could speak up for the Uyghur people, or for the political prisoners in China, for Hong Kong, for Tibet, on all these occasions. If we put enough pressure on these people, just knowing that what it means for them to go to Beijing. So there's definitely a lot we can do, even if Beijing is to host it next year. We can definitely make that a battleground.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. Now we're going to move on to the next question. The rhetoric from political leaders is much stronger now than in 2008 for obvious reasons. But what do you think would sway or stop them from abiding by their principles and boycotting? And what might China do to appease them? Whoever wants to jump in on that question, just feel free.
I mean, I can say that it's a little bit complicated, and there's a lot of things that could go into this answer. I mean, obviously, I think this is why we've discussed that there's this multifaceted approach to addressing this issue, which is we have to address corporate sponsors because, money talks. So in terms of what might keep people from their principles, it's the trouble of it. It's the money aspect. It's also, I think, a lot of willingness to continue to just listen to China's narrative and accept these face value empty statements from them. We see that in general. And in terms of what might China do to appease them, it's that same typical thing of, the IOC keeps saying we've received assurances that human rights will be respected in the context of the games. And unfortunately, we see a lot of political leaders kind of willing to go along with that. So this is why we need to have civic society raising their voices. We need to target corporate sponsors, and we also need to ask that athletes join us in raising their voices. That is key. It is really important, because another aspect of that, of what keeps them from maybe having that harsher rhetoric, is this reticence, rightfully so, to punish athletes. And that's not the intention of asking them to raise their voices. The intention is not to punish athletes, but this is the reality of the situation. And so there's a lot of things that go into that, and I'm sure others can add more, but that's kind of the short answer.
So is there any one of the panelists would like to add on? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, please. Sorry.
Right.
Enghebatu.
Okay. I just wanted to add to the way that how China appease the world or the countries is, of course, the money. China is very good at using money, and you guys know the China's the big project, road and Belt and Road Initiative, right? So if you look at this project, I think 138 countries already joined this project. knowingly this is a policy, it's a foreign policy for, the debt trap foreign policy, and a lot of countries already started suffering from the debt. But still China is able to push their agenda through all this. So I think this is very classic Chinese way of handling things. So they will continue to use money and the market, and to appease the countries and government.
Yes. Thank you, Enghebatu and Lhadon.
No, yeah, I was just going to say, I think that we all, I want to make a plug for us being positive and shooting for the moon. I think that everything seems impossible, especially when it comes to moving the Chinese government and our governments to act, until it's not. And so I think while we may be concerned about the position that the Biden administration might take now, while obviously some of us, I'm Tibetan Canadian, and I'm appalled that Prime Minister Trudeau has not done more, said more, and is hiding on this issue, I think, behind ridiculous claims or calls for investigation on the ground. I think that people look to us, the leaders of all these movements, the leading organizations. We are the ones working together, speaking powerfully, clearly, and shooting for the moon right now. Why not? That can change history. We can achieve the impossible. That is the lesson of history, that a small group of people can do that if we mobilize, if we're strategic, and if we focus on the right targets and mobilize in the right sort of ways. And I think that just this idea that the way things have been, or the way that China is so effective in, demobilizing forces that work against them, the regime there, I just think we need to just be single-minded and not looking this way or that way as to what they might do, and just go headlong into what we believe is the strongest possible position on this issue, which I believe is calling for a boycott and calling on our governments to organize themselves and work together, and to use and seize this opportunity, seize this moment to really make a change, or God help us all, what will happen in the future with an emboldened, again, more dangerously legitimized Beijing regime. And I just want to make a plug for people to check out my colleague, the wonderful activist leader Tendor, Tibetan colleague of mine, has written a piece calling for boycott and talking about the strategic value of a boycott and how it actually could save lives. Just the strategy of boycott is often in the lead up to, right? There's the threat of boycott, a legitimate threat of boycott, what that can do to change things. So please check out his piece in the National Interest, I believe. It's called Why a China 2022 Olympics Boycott Could Save Countless Uyghur Lives. And it's extremely well argued, reasoned. It talks about Moscow, how this is different, how the times are different. And check it out if you can.
Yeah, thank you, Lhadon, for this really uplifting answer. So our next question will be, what risk does the national security law pose on visiting athletes or people attending the Olympics in Beijing? Would there be any one of you guys who would like to answer?
Well, I can just state quite plainly that it is an enormous risk. I know a lot of our groups are engaging with different Olympic committees also to educate them on this, so that they can speak to athletes and let them know, and that can be part of building momentum towards this boycott campaign. But it's also worth it for people to know this is an enormous risk to athletes and people attending the Olympics. The Chinese regime is what it is, but in these recent years, it's not even the same China as a few years ago. And so people do need to be aware of those risks and the reality of the consequences and punishment, retaliation that they might suffer as a result of even voicing opposition to the mainline that the regime's putting out.
All right. Thank you so much, Julie, for taking over this question. Then,
on the other hand,
yeah.
I think that could be something to motivate some bold athletes to work on if they want to challenge that ridiculous law. For example, if they do something outside of China and then go into Olympics, will China arrest them? That would be something.
Yes, that would definitely be something. Thank you so much, everybody. Then it's already been 1 hour and 30 minutes, unfortunately, so we are going to move on to our final question of today's session. For viewers that are tuning in today, can each of you say one thing that you think viewers can do to make a difference in this campaign? Whoever wants to jump in, feel free. Lhadon, yeah?
I would say write to it sounds so basic, but just get off of when this is finished, just get on your email or get on the phone and call your elected representative or email them, send them a letter and just say, you are extremely concerned about the upcoming Olympics to take place in Beijing for this and this reason. And you want them to, whatever country you may be in, to push the executive branch to engage at least in a diplomatic boycott, and that you hopefully would also call for just a total boycott. And just start getting this on their radars. Just start to get this out there and then publicize that on your social media. Share this article of my colleague, Why a China 2022 Olympics boycott could save countless Uyghur lives. Let's start getting this threat really out there and beyond just our circles of rights advocates and activists, and to our, let's start asking. I have lots of friends and family who aren't engaged on this issue in an active way, or who, are not Tibetan in my case. And this is the kind of thing we can ask people to do to help us spread the word. It's very simple.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback off of that. These are simple actions, and just asking someone to join you when you write a letter. Ask someone to do it with you. Mobilize others. It's very easy to do as well, and then you can replicate and multiply these simple actions. So.
I think, yes, we still need to protest. We can mobilize our own community, work with other communities, and we can use internet, social media to carry out some different forms of protest. I think there have been actually quite a lot of events organized by the Mongolians in here in the United States, also in the independent country of Mongolia, as protesting this. So there have been a lot of protests and events that's still very useful in for protesting, and we try our best. It might happen, but we still need to try our best to at least publicize the issues and the human rights violations that are happening in China, and Tibet, East Turkestan, Southern Mongolia, and Hong Kong.
Yeah, I think you all said it very well. Everyone can do more to spread the word, to raise awareness, especially if you know, for example, someone who might be related to this, or any Olympics, for example, Tokyo Olympic, if people are going there, or if you know some athlete, especially, we welcome any contact with these athletes. Just raise awareness, let them know what you heard today. It's very important.
Okay, so thank you all for answering this really important question. I think it's you guys all raised this really good point. Either it's mobilize your own community or execute your right as a citizen to contact your representatives, or you just to raise awareness, especially to those stakeholders. I think this is like really a good takeaway for our viewers today to what they're going to do as a next step. So like again, as we are approaching to our closing of this session, I would like to thank all the panelists. We have Julie, Lhadon, Fongso, Enghebatu, and also Benedict, who has to leave earlier because he has next commitment. But we're so glad that we're having you guys here today. And also, I would like to just to remind our viewers here that we're continuing to have this session. We have our third session tomorrow. And all these materials and like the videos and everything will be on our campaign website. It's nobeijing2022.org. So you can easily find it on the internet, and everything, including the session yesterday, today, and tomorrow will be on that. And also just an update for the alternative session tomorrow. It's gonna be our No Beijing 2022 press briefing. So the time will be slightly different. It's gonna start from just like half an hour and a half later than what we had today. So it's gonna start from 3 p.m. GMT, which is 4 p.m. CET and 10 a.m. in the morning in EST time zone. So we're also gonna have a bunch of representatives from different community. We're having Francis Hui from the Hong Kong community. We are having Zurmate from World Uyghur Congress. We're having Chen Biao again, representing the Chinese human rights lawyers and activists. And we're having Dorji Tethong from Student for Free Tibet. We're having Gloria from International Tibet Network, and they will be briefing about the campaign, this No Beijing 2022 campaign tomorrow for us. And just before we closing up, I would really would like to echo with what all the panelists has just said, and especially what Lhadon has just said. We've already made a momentum and we're shooting for the moon. So I would like to encourage all our speakers and also our viewers to keep going on with that. I think we've done a lot, especially when we look back from the 2008 campaign. So there's still a long year to go. So let's just work it up together. So thank you guys for having this good time with us, and thank you the viewers, and we're looking forward to see you all as a viewer, as a speaker tomorrow in the session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care and stay safe.